Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Cahill. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our weekly humanitarian webinar. Today's webinar will be on balancing humanitarian delivery and risk. The Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs is an independent center reporting directly to the President of the university, and we act as a bridge between the humanitarian and the academic communities. We do so through a number of ways. Training, we have two graduate programs, the Master of Arts in International Humanitarian Action and the Master of Science in Humanitarian Studies, as well as a thriving undergraduate program. Also, we have a number of research areas: education, innovation, design, children in armed conflict, as well as our own imprint, the Refuge Press, our own gallery, the Refuge Gallery, and a different series of lectures, conferences, etc. We did not have a webinar last week because of the US elections, but we are thrilled to start them up again, and these will continue until the end of the year. Today's webinar will be held by Kjell Lauvik. Kjell is an old friend of ours. As I mentioned, it's on balancing humanitarian delivery and risk. And during this Zoom, Kjell will explore topical challenges and considerations in the context of security management and humanitarian delivery through the key questions of: is the world getting more dangerous? How do you know it is too dangerous for your operations? And how does duty of care apply to humanitarian security? Kjell himself is a dedicated security and risk management professional with over 20 years of security experience in over 60 countries. He's originally from Norway, has a PhD in conflict resolution, specifically in hostage management, and a master's in emergency management and planning, in addition to a number of industry certifications. After serving in the military, he joined UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, as a field safety advisor, where he worked for 19 years, lastly as UNHCR Chief of Security Operations. He joined the Aga Khan Development Network on September 1st, 2018 as their Director of Security. Kjell has lectured for us a number of times in the past and is the professor in our asynchronous program on security management, delivering aid in potentially dangerous situations. The next iteration of that course will be in spring 2021. And again, Camille can point you to registration information for that. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Kjell to this weekly webinar. And Kjell, I turn it over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you, Brendan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's good to be with you today. As Brendan mentioned, I'm going to look at how to balance humanitarian delivery and risk. And one of the big questions is looking at the trends, looking at what is true, what is not true. So I want to start with the question: is the world getting more dangerous? Everyone I talk to in the field keeps talking about how much worse it is getting. And to a degree, that's true. We'll come to that. But in the larger sense of the world, we're actually getting safer. If you study especially the Gallup Global Peace Index, we find that most of people, 68% of people, actually feel pretty safe around the world. Lifespans are increasing globally. We're getting older. Places like Singapore and Norway, more than 90% of people are feeling safe. So overall in the world, it seems like it's a safer place. So how come then that we feel that the world is getting worse? Well, we tend to focus on what we see in the media. So things that happen in Syria, in Mexico, in Afghanistan recently now. Terrorism is a big one. People are still talking about September 11 in the US, and still the odds of dying from terrorism will come to is diminishingly small. What we tend to also forget is conflicts that have stopped. I was looking at Sri Lanka today, and the big headline is Sri Lanka rescues 100 whales after mass stranding on the beach. So that is what's going on in Sri Lanka today. It's a much calmer place. And the same in Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia, where I spent 3 years. Wow, slides going back here. Where I spent some time early on in my career, is getting much calmer. Colombia has just signed a peace deal that have ended 5 decades of civil war. So what is happening is that we're looking on what we see in the media, and we focus on what's happened recently, and we tend to forget what is no longer taking place. So let's look at some perspectives. From 2010 to 2016, the number of wars increased by 1/3, from 31 to 41. But if you look at the bigger picture, the longer period of time, it actually fell by 20%. If you look from 1990 to 2004, the conflicts fell. So we tend to focus on what's happened really recently and forget the longer term on it. Another big factor is that modern wars tend to be small and localized. This is fairly isolated conflict, high intensity, but isolated conflict. The more destructive, bigger war, costly kind of war between the great power state has not occurred for more than 60 years since World War II. And even terrorism is a far less concern than many assume. So as I mentioned before, for an American, the odds of dying in a terrorist attack is 1 in 20 million. Which is half the risk of dying from dog bites. And we're not talking about a war on dogs. We're talking about a war on terrorism. And it's a perception based on a recency bias, based on what we see in the media. Even lightning, I mean, there's the odds of dying in lightning in the US is 1 in 700,000. It's 1 in 20 million to die from terrorism. Automobile accident, there were 32,000 car accidents in the US last year. Again, something like 11 people dying from terrorist attack, American dying from terrorist attacks globally. We tend to focus on things that we read and see in media, and we tend to focus on high impact events like terrorism, and we don't see the other risks that are occurring in the background. Now, that's the world. Let's look at the NGOs, because it's slightly different with the NGO community. And that's where aid workers are right when they say that things are getting worse. In 2019, we had the highest recorded incidents in history of aid workers. 483 aid workers were attacked in 277 separate incidents. And this is the highest on record of all time since we started recording data about 20 years ago. 125 aid workers killed, 234 wounded, 124 kidnapped. It's been a steady increase in casualties in the NGO or humanitarian community. What has happened today is Syria for the first time, where most of the major attacks took place. And what we'll see is a trend. There's typically 4 or 5 countries that have the vast majority of the incidents, and the other operations are fairly safe. But the other highest incidents were South Sudan, DRC, Afghanistan, and CAR, Central African Republic. So this is the trend over the past 10 years, or since 2010. And as we can see, there's a steady increase in both victims and number of attacks. And you look at 2013 was very high. That was when Syria and South Sudan both had pretty high intensity in conflict, and the same in Afghanistan. Afghanistan came in with a high number of incidents that year. That's a bit of an outlier. Otherwise, the trend has been steadily going upwards until 2019, now being the highest in history. So what does that mean for security management? We need to break down the data slightly more. And when we start looking at the type of incidents over 2019, if you look at Syria, you see that 30 of the incidents were from aerial bombardment, while in South Sudan, it's 21 of the incidents from bodily assault. Syria is the only one who has aerial bombardment, and this is why conducting a proper security risk assessment is so important. We need to identify the threats, and then we need to identify the appropriate risk reduction measure based on that threat. You don't protect yourself the same way in South Sudan as you do in Syria. In Syria, you need overhead protection, you need bunkers to run into, you need to know how to deal with your vehicles when you're on the road in case there's aerial bombardment. In South Sudan, there are more protocols of safe rooms, road movements, protocols dealing with the local population, acceptance strategies, etc. So doing a proper risk assessment is the fundamental for good security management, identifying the threats and reduce the risk for the specific threats in your environment. If you're going to try to protect against everything that could potentially go wrong, it's going to get very, very costly, and you won't be carrying out a whole lot of humanitarian activities. Okay, so looking at the trends, working for a humanitarian organization in a high-risk environment is very dangerous. We look at the top 5 or 6, we can see the casualty rates are fairly high. Not necessarily so in medium and low-risk environment. The higher the security threat, the more likely it is that the organization will be required to operate. There's a reason why we're there. People need us. We're there to deliver humanitarian aid. And a lot of the questions that came in before this deals with exactly this. How do we operate in a dangerous environment? What takes precedence was a question. Do we focus on security or do we focus on delivery? And we'll come to that slightly later. Quite often it's the same forces that create the need for humanitarian assistance that are the ones that actually pose the threat to aid workers. And that can be a challenge. It's one of the reasons why there are never or very rarely consequences for breaking the law against humanitarian workers is that we don't want to file complaints or reports to the police because we have to continue to operate in the environment. If we go out against kidnappers or a local group and file a complaint with the police, have members of that gang arrested, we have to continue working in that environment, and the risk could actually increase for the humanitarian community based on that. So it's a very, very complex environment to work in, high risk. We have to deliver, and the people we help are sometimes the people that provide threat against us as well. All right, so let's look at understanding the attacks on aid workers. So obviously, we're much more likely to be attacked in countries experiencing conflict. And active conflict with guns is by far the highest indicator of high risk here. We can talk about kidnapping, assault, and all, but where people are killed, there's an active conflict going on. The more violent the conflict, the greater number of aid workers attacked. Generalized insecurity does not influence the risk of aid worker attacks. So let me think back to when I was working in Kenya, for instance. I spent 3 years in Kenya. Nairobi at that time had a very, very high general crime situation. Carjacking in particular, there were up to 90 carjackings a week at one point. There was no additional increased risk to aid workers. Aid workers were also targeted for carjacking, but it was just they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, statistically tied with the local population. So there was no additional risk just because you were an aid worker. So there was no targeting specifically of the aid worker community. So just because it's generally insecure doesn't influence the risk of aid worker attacks. International military presence, this came as a surprise for me when I did the research. And international military presence does not necessarily add to aid worker risk, but the UN peacekeeping forces do. Countries with peacekeeping operations see more attack against aid workers. And if I was to guess, I think that's the mixing of the UN mandate and the humanitarian mandate along the peacekeeping mandate. They're seen as one, and aid workers are targeted because of that. The degree of civilian targeting has no effect on risk to aid workers. So conflicts involving active targeting of civilians by either governments or insurgents does not really see a race of attack on aid workers. They fight each other, but it doesn't necessarily spill over to the aid worker community. And that's an important factor to take into place. Or take into consideration. We aim to stay and deliver. We aim to be in the field and deliver as long as we absolutely can. So just because there's conflict between two parties, it does not necessarily mean that the aid community is targeted. Perhaps, again, very obvious, but more economically and politically developed states have fewer attacks. And I don't think that one needs particular discussions around it. If it's more stable, more money in circulation in society, typically there are fewer attacks on aid workers. All right, so that's the first part on trends where we're heading. So to summarize, the world at large is actually not getting worse. People live longer. The big global wars are no longer taking place. The smaller conflicts, but it doesn't really. We live longer. It's safer out there. Aid worker community, very different. Increasing targeting over time. Even taking into account that we have a lot more aid workers today than we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. Even with that factored in, there is an increased targeting of aid workers out there. Second part now, we'll go to acceptable risk. And just the word acceptable risk carries some challenges with it. It's something I've struggled my whole career to get managers to sign off on and say, yes, I accept this risk. The comeback is very often, we don't accept any risks to us. The reality is that we do. When I worked in UNHCR, the average was that we had 1.5 staff killed per year. That means we accept that risk, or we would have closed down operations. So we do accept some risk. We don't aim to get to zero risk. We aim to get down to an acceptable level of risk. It's a concept that's very, very difficult to discuss with managers. So once we've done our risk assessment, we've identified our risk level. The next question, the final question then is to say, all right, is this good enough? the risk is medium or the risk is high, do we still go on with our activities? The simple answer to that is it depends on how important the activity is. And I often use an example that if my wife asks me in the middle of the night to drive down an icy road to a pharmacy to get her some headache medication because she's got a slight headache, and that's not worth the risk. Don't tell her that, but that's not worth the risk. But if someone was bleeding out or we were about to deliver a baby, whatever, then you take the risk. You don't drive on red light if everything is fine. You may drive on red light if you're chased by a vehicle or you have to go to something important. So essentially, the higher the more important the activity, the higher risk we're willing to take. So how important is the activity? Will the anticipated gains justify accepting a higher level of risk? Linked to the first question, but if what we achieve by staying present in an operation, quite often just being present in an operation will stabilize the situation, right? So will the anticipated gains of us being there make us accept a higher level of risk? Well, has enough been done to lower the risk to a level that is reasonable? So it's fairly easy to go and say, right, we'll accept this because it's really important what we do. We still have an obligation to lower the risk to a level that is reasonable and to a level that is reasonable to expect staff to take. One thing is to make the decision, another thing is to go out there and deliver it. And especially, this is important when it comes to national staff. More and more the trend is sort of remote management, and we see this in trends of national staff being targeted. We're asking staff to go out deeper in the field while international staff sit further behind in capitals or in regional offices. And have we done enough to lower the risk to a level that's reasonable for our national staff or staff to take the risk? Another question to ask, are the risks that have been identified manageable in that context? So can we manage the risk in the context we're at? Context differs. Context differs vastly from where we are and what we're doing. So those are the questions really. It has to be answered. It's a big part of duty of care. We'll come to that soon. But those are the questions to ask in relation to acceptable risk. More specifically, the principles for acceptable risk are pretty clearly laid out. So principle one is don't accept unnecessary risk. And this is a guiding principle. Don't take risk you don't have to take. A lot of us feel pressure from donors, from media to take risk by being present, going out and be perceived or be seen to do something. But we can't accept risk just because of that. We don't take unnecessary risk. I'm all for taking necessary risk, but don't accept unnecessary risk. As I mentioned before, do accept risk when the benefits outweigh the risk. If what you achieve by being present, feeding a starving population, preventing conflict in an area, vaccines, whatever, when the benefit outweighs the risk, that is acceptable risk. Make risk management decision at the right level. This is important, and quite often we tend to centralize risk management decisions. You want to keep the decision as close to the field as possible, is my opinion. It depends on how your organization is structured, but the accountability framework should be in place, and an accountability framework should indicate where the decision sits at. And the last point, everything reasonable should be done to reduce the risk. It's obvious. We use a concept that's called ALARP, as low as reasonable, practicable, as low as possible, as low as reasonable possible. So those are the principles for acceptable risk. It's probably, we could talk about this for hours. You need to do a proper program assessment, identifying which of your programs are the most important, which of your programs are the last to stop if the security situation gets worse. And that's what you start balancing then your risk against. Putting a lot into 20 minutes here. All right, moving on to duty of care. A lot of questions, or some questions on that as well, came in before the debate. So duty of care is a sort of all-encompassing concept. It wraps around security, dates back long time. 1856 is the first time it was discussed in legal documents. It's an employer's obligation to take all necessary and feasible measures to safeguard health, safety, and integrity of their employees. The UN calls it a non-waivable duty on the part of the organization to mitigate or address foreseeable risk that may harm or injure its personnel. So it is what, bluntly speaking, is what NGOs are being sued at in the field. Legally, attacking the duty of care is where people go. Every organization I've been to and talked to, I've had lawsuits, and it's typically on breach of duty of care. People been kidnapped, it's a breach of duty of care. We should have foreseen that that could have happened, and they take us to court over it. Killings, the same. It's all duty of care. There's a new Swiss, relatively new study led by Sinfo that has really broken down duty of care into these 4 boxes. It's a fantastic document. I'll go through the highlights of it now, and then lastly provide a little checklist on what managers should think of. So the 4 boxes are duty of information, duty of prevention, duty of monitoring, and duty of intervention. So duty of information is simply the required to do risk assessment and inform staff of the risk. This means that you need to do your risk assessment, identify what threats are present, and then you have to tell your employees about them. They have to be aware of the risk, they have to accept the risk, they need to know how to avoid the risk, and possibly the opportunity to not engage the risk. At all levels. This happens at in the recruitment, at the job description, inform people about what risks they should take in. On the onboarding, briefing, security and safety policies should be presented. In training, if you're in a sort of medium high level, you should probably have high risk environment training, heat training. Risk assessments have to take place, and pre-departure travel briefings is also a requirement, should be a requirement for most high-risk environments. Informed consent, very, very important. You must tell people about the risk they're taking, and they must have the ability to not engage with that risk. And staff must have the right to withdraw the consent should they be uncomfortable with any situation. This is something managers tend to not like. They feel it's going to be misused, but it is listed as a core part of duty of care that staff have informed consent and the right to withdraw from what they perceive to be a dangerous activity, and this should not impact their job or their career. Very quickly, duty of prevention. A lack of guidelines. Guidelines do not meet the relevant requirements, could be taken as negligence. So doing your risk assessment and then putting in place guidelines and measures to reduce the risk is important. Risk treatment, pre-departure measures for travelers. Insurance is a preventive measure as well. A lot of national staff, in particular around in the aid community, do not have proper insurance. Duty of monitoring. This is if, all right, I remember the attack on the latest hotel attack in Kenya. Within minutes, I knew which of my travelers were in Kenya and I could inform them. So having regular monitoring of the situation, monitoring guidelines, running auditing of your system, incident information management, documentation, all of this has to be in place. Briefing when staff arrive, and then keeping an eye on the environment while they're in there. Last box, duty of intervention. It should be judged against the principle of proportionality. So higher risk needs higher intervention. This is what Norwegian Refugee Council ended up being sentenced on as a breach of duty of care when they had kidnappings in Dadaab. The measures they'd taken, they hadn't informed of the change, they hadn't taken sufficient measures. So that's crisis management, health and safety, redress measures, all of the things listed here. All right, I'm running out of time. My last slide goes on what managers need to know. So this is sort of my 10-point checklist for managers when it comes to duty of care. 1, explain all the rules and requirements to everyone. Explain the reasoning behind the security rules. Security officers in particular tend to just say, hey, these are the rules, just follow them. That's not good enough. We have to explain the reasoning behind security regulations, behind security rules. Reward and praise of staff members for following the rules. I had a situation in my previous organizations when I went to put a note for the file in a couple of the drivers' files, and it was positive, it was praise. And the human resource officer looked at me and said, I've never done that before. I have no idea how to do that, because it was a positive. It was praise for staff members who had done well for security. They knew how to put it on the record if they'd done anything wrong. They didn't know how to put it on record praising staff. Equally, sanction those who break the rules. ICRC, for instance, are very good at this. Very open security management. But if you break the rules, there are consequences for it. Testing staff from time to time to see if they know the rules. This is important. It's about monitoring. Monitor performance, give feedback, follow the rules yourself. A lot of managers are very good at telling staff they need to go on training, not necessarily so good at going on training themselves. So following the rules, setting a good example, lead by example. You're supposed to be a leader, lead. If I was a manager, I would have staff sign a document saying they've been briefed and understand the rules. This is part of protecting the organization. If there's nothing in place saying I've received my briefing, I understand the rules, I understand the risk, there's really nothing you can come back on if they say otherwise. So make sure you document the process. Staff meetings, make sure security is a standing point in staff meeting. In every corporate organization I've heard on, security is a standing point. In the UN, the way security is positioned, it should be a standing agenda point. But I recommend that for all NGOs as well. It's just a good way of protecting the agency. And then the last one, regularly run exercises and drill to illustrate proper procedures. Knowing the rules and acting on the rules, vastly different. You have to practice and build up muscle memory to do it. Quick example, last thing I'm going to say here. I made a perfect plan for fire safety in my Nairobi office until I had a fire truck come out and they couldn't fit through my gate. So that's why exercise and drill is important. You learn what's not working and you start drilling people into doing the right thing.